Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. We're so glad that you can join us today. My name is Shahid Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of American Muslim Institution. We've now passed 1 year into this global pandemic. And while many things have dramatically been impacted, be it restaurants, small businesses, and healthcare, and really everyday people's lives, one area we have come to see and hear more about is the digital sector, whether it's Zoom, which has now become a household name, as is the term zoomed out, as I'm sure many of you are today. But another company that is peaking today is Twitter. And it's reached an all-time high to its market cap in the third quarter of 2020. The app allows users to share their thoughts and information in less than 280 characters. It's changing the way we consume information. The pandemic has seen an increase in individuals that are on the platform, but also getting their information from it. While Twitter is not alone, we have seen companies like Facebook and Parler increase their presence. And the shift to these platforms has led to very different viewing habits. While information overload appears to be everywhere and sensory overload is a real thing, we have seen traditional media adjust and their strategies adjust accordingly. Today, we'll hear from those in journalism field share their thoughts and ideas about where the industry is going. Are the digital changes a good thing or a bad thing? And what American Muslims need to know in order to ensure their voices are fairly and adequately represented. As many of you know, AMI was founded in 2015 to tackle the challenges facing the American Muslim community and their representation. We believe by working with media, journalists, elected officials, and impartial stakeholders, we can continue to transform the narrative about Muslims and Islam in this country. At this moment, I'd like to invite the president of AMI, Ambassador Islam Siddiqui, to the virtual dais. Ambassador Siddiqui served as a senior advisor for global food security at the Center for Strategic and International Relations. Prior to that, he was in the Obama administration from 2010 to 14 as a chief agriculture negotiator with the Office of the Trade Rep. He has quite the illustrious biography and has served in government for over 40 years. Ambassador Siddiqui, the floor is yours. Ambassador, you're muted. Ambassador Siddiqui, you're still muted.
Am I on?
You're on, go ahead.
Thank you, Shahid, for introducing me for this warm introduction. The AMI has been in the space in terms of hosting journalism for about 5 years, but this is the first this evening where we are especially hosting some of the rising stars in our community who are specializing in digital media. So I am looking forward to this discussion, especially person who are in their 60s and above. I think we need a lot more to learn about this tool because the future lies with those who have this knowledge in terms of this social media as well as digital media. So I would be looking forward to the discussion. In order for us to have this discussion, we have tapped the services of a young journalist who is from our community. She is has been working with CBS for the last 15 years or so. And she's working with 60 News program for the last since 2015, reporting from Japan, Iraq, as well as North Pole. I wish I was there with you, Aisha. When you went to the North Pole, this is a beautiful landscape you're covering in the reporting. She's now producing the 60 Minutes spin-off, which is 60 Minutes plus the streaming version of CBS News, the most popular watched program in America. So Aisha, we are glad that you could join us. You have been tapped to moderate this program. Wish you all the best, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you so much. Thank you for the intro, and I'm happy to be joining everybody in doing this today. And the topic has been introduced by Shahid, and I just wanted to to touch on that a little bit, as I've made recently my foray into digital journalism, I've noticed one of the biggest things that I think will be a positive out of this is the chance to diversify the quote unquote newsroom. And I just wanted to read you guys something really interesting that was supposed to happen and hasn't. This is from CJR. So in 1979, the American Society of News Editors pledged that by the year 2000, the percentage of racial and ethnic minorities in newsrooms would match that of the population at large. They noted that this was the right thing to do and in the industry's economic self-interest, and that it was particularly important to lift people of color into management. That we have, as a society, failed spectacularly at achieving that goal. According to the Census Bureau, racial and ethnic minorities comprise almost 40% of the US population, yet make up less than 17% of newsroom staff at print and online publications, and only 13% of newspaper leadership. I think this is relevant to us as Muslims and people who have a minority voice in this country. I think that that is something that we can, I think, on now that we have moved into more of a digital space, and especially with the pandemic and not having to be in newsrooms and not having to live in certain cities, and all of that will hopefully help. So to begin, I wanted to introduce a great panel of journalists we have with us. And as I introduce you guys, if you want to flip on your cameras, that would be helpful. First up is Ayman Ismail, an award-winning journalist, photographer, writer, and podcaster at Slate Magazine. He hosted and produced Who's Afraid of Ayman Ismail, a video series that moved beyond stereotypes of both American Muslims and their self-professed adversaries. For that show, he was awarded the Goldzier Prize and an ACME Next Award. He hosted Man Up, a weekly podcast about men and their relationships with faith, family, and race. GQ has called him one of 2019's Voices of the New Masculinity. He was most recently, a week ago, awarded a WGA award for his long-form story on Cup Foods, the Palestinian corner store and their employee who called the police on George Floyd. So congrats on that. And then next we have Akbar Ahmed. You want to flip on. He is HuffPost's senior foreign affairs reporter based in Washington, D.C. A native Pakistani, Akbar has reported from across the middle Muslim majority world, Europe, and elsewhere. In 2019, he became the first ever Pakistani journalist to secure a press credential to report from Israel and Palestine. He has previously written for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Generation Progress, and in Pakistan, Newsline Magazine and Dawn, and has provided expert commentary for MSNBC, Al Jazeera, BBC, and events including South by Southwest. Welcome and thank you. And then last, we have Rawan Al Baba. She is a digital producer at the PBS NewsHour Student Reporting Labs. She develops digital content strategies and helps lead production teams within the SRL network. She recently received her master's degree in journalism at Georgetown University. She was born and raised in Washington, D.C. to Lebanese parents and is a first-generation American. Welcome, and thank you guys for doing this. I'm looking forward to our chat. And I would like to begin with a very broad question. And I want to know how each of you define journalism or news and what you think the goal is.
I'll start. Thank you so much for having this, by the way. I'm in awe of the organization, and I'm so happy to share this time with you guys. I'm a big fan of everyone in this panel, so thank you so much for being here. So journalism to me is just creative storytelling that also informs people. Yeah, I'm gonna stick with that.
Okay, Rawan?
Yeah, I definitely echo what Ayman said, but I mean, I think journalism is a mix of storytelling and learning. I work in education reporting, so it's all about learning and making sure what you're learning is correct. Fact checking is very important. So just a mix of learning and teaching as well, teaching through storytelling.
Thank you so much for having me. To me, it's kind of two things. I'd say the first is sharing different kinds of stories that can't be shared. I mean, for me, I went into journalism. My grandmother was the first editor and publisher in Pakistan and like a pioneering female journalist there. And she was the first woman to speak at Al Azhar University in Cairo, ever in like 1,000 years, right? And she talked about Kashmir. And not a lot of Egyptians knew about Kashmir in 1957 in Cairo, right? So it's building those connections and then also being based in DC and being very focused on foreign policy. It's really about holding power to account, and it is challenging people who have taxpayer money, important positions, and the ability to decide whether you can live with your family or get married or do whatever you want. So that's what it is to me.
Great. So now to our current topic. So how, in your experience from all your various backgrounds, all very impressive, by the way, how do you feel the pandemic has sped up the shift to digital journalism?
I can start with this one because I feel like even before the pandemic, my job was so focused on digital storytelling because I work with a lot of teenagers. So how do you reach teenagers? And then, the news hour is such a traditional broadcast, nightly news that when, they brought us in as this, group of people to connect with younger people, to connect with teenagers and young people in America, we really had to kind of go where young people are, which is social media and digital platforms. And I think the pandemic has only made me busier in a good way completely because, now we're learning that we can shoot video through Zoom and we can use our phones and we can use the resources that we have around us. And we don't necessarily need like big fancy cameras and microphones to create content and tell stories. And that's something that we're relaying to a lot of the students that I work with is that, you can tell a story just from being in your bedroom and they have. So it's been really exciting to be able to tell the different stories that we wouldn't have been able to otherwise because a student in Washington, D.C. can, interview someone in California and, that's not a barrier anymore because there's things like Zoom. So yeah, that's a little bit for me.
Okay. Do you guys have any? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have one point. I don't know about everybody else, but I hated my commute, and I would just kind of sit there on the train like a zombie and just stare at my phone and doom scroll, and it would sort of put me in a different space. And so being at home, first of all, I acknowledge the privilege of being able to work from home. That's amazing. But also having that privilege means that I can focus more on the product. I can think more local. A lot of times I'm always thinking about what stories would be interesting to a reader in Rhode Island or Florida or Maine. But I think one thing that was really magical about the COVID was that it sort of decentralized the country. And now everyone was really focused on their local areas and their personal stories. So I saw this really inspiring return to local journalism. People were reporting on things that were happening in their schools, in their neighborhood, food pantry stories. And that to me was really exciting. So yeah, I'm really curious to see what happens next. I'm really hoping that we stay curious about what's happening next door. So inshallah that happens.
I just flagged, for me, one of the worrying aspects of what COVID has done to journalism is it's exacerbated a shift that's already been happening, which is a real revenue crunch for news outlets. And you've seen a number of journalistic outlets lay off people in the last year due to the pandemic, economic slowdown. You've seen The Atlantic, owned by one of the richest people in America, lay off many people. My own employer has laid off a third of our newsroom earlier this month. And I would just really emphasize to people that that's one of these harbingers of the future that we're getting in this COVID period, sort of how we're being sped up on a timeline. And if you don't invest in journalism now, you will miss these people when they're gone. I think the number of people, journalists at the national level and local level who have lost their jobs in the last year is like in the hundreds, if not over 1,000. And we need to stem that ASAP because without journalists, we can't have democracy or really anything we want.
And that's a really good point. But to that point, there is a whole crop, and you guys know it, there comes through WhatsApp and everything else, of journalists or people disseminating information. And, you know, somebody like who's not so savvy will point to it and say, there's a logo, they have a microphone, that this must be news. I mean, anybody can create content and anybody can really call it news. So is everybody being able to produce their own content or news necessarily a good thing? And then how do you deal with the fact checking and the kind of standards issue? Like, I know where I work, we have really rigid standards and practices. You have a book, you have to follow it. You have lawyers who watch what you do. If you don't, you know, your job's in jeopardy. So how do you trust the average person and everybody who just wants to create content and get information? How do you kind of vet that?
I'm going to go ahead and say an unpopular opinion here. I think it's wonderful. I think it's awesome. I'm not mad at InfoWars for doing what they do. I think it's the nature of the internet. You can find anything. And so I think it isn't a failure of people producing too much. I think the failure here is this, you know, the lack of education when it comes to readership. I think we need to really understand as writers that who we're writing for, you know, people who are paranoid. We need to try and predict their concerns and address those directly. Because at least at Slate, I know we sort of have like this really busy Slack channel and we're constantly sharing ideas and we're having these arguments. But from an outsider's perspective, I bet people would be really confused about the types of stuff that we choose to zero in on. So I think, you know, yeah, you run into these reporters in the street, and I've done some reporting at protests in like Minneapolis and like Ferguson and in New York City, and these people are out there, they're doing the work. So if journalism is just creative writing mixed with information, they count as journalists. So what can we do as journalists to inform people? What could we do to kind of earn people's trust?
I'd have to agree with Ayman's unpopular opinion, which I think, I mean, honestly, I think everyone has access to information and has access to a camera on their phone, has access to the internet. And coming from a family where, you know, my mom, for example, is very connected on WhatsApp and what's happening, and she's sending me all these messages and like, did you see this? She knows breaking news before I do, and so I'm constantly having to be like, okay, where did that come from? Who sent it to you? So I totally agree that, you know, we have to do you know, a better job at teaching media literacy and just kind of being better fact checkers, because it's the nature of, I think it's the future of the internet. It's just kind of what's happening. And if we're going to say like, you can't be a journalist unless, you know, you've gone to 4 years of journalism school and you work at a publication, then we're shutting out so many people who are doing really important on the ground work, as Ayman said.
I totally agree. I think media literacy is hugely important. I would put the onus on that maybe away from overstretched media organizations, which like are struggling to even support their own staffs. But I would also point to kind of I think there's a disconnect to what you were saying, Eamon, about the nature of the internet, and that is a generational divide. Today, there was a very worrying development at USA Today where they fired a staffer called Himal Javeri, who had tweeted about a mass shooting. She got fired because there was ginned up outrage. And I think this is what we need to notice is like, we're kind of out of the phase of like the golden days of citizen journalism, which was like Ferguson and people really just being on the streets, doing the work, being activists, sharing their stories, right? I think now you have a lot of bots, targeted harassment, and campaigns that are run against people out of bad faith, right? And are not coming from a place of citizen journalism, but are coming organized by particularly right-wing sort of propagandists. So I just urge us to be really careful about who is posing as a citizen journalist in this era, and that's really important to note too.
Trolls are very, very real.
So I think to all of your points, I get a lot of questions about, well, I read something and you're telling me, well, that's not really true, but how do I, like, how do I know? Do I have to read 9 different things, or do I have to go subscribe to like, 12 different things and then read it and then figure it out myself? And for people who are not as discerning, how do they identify what's fake news and what's not when they go on the internet? And I think teaching media literacy is one of those, but is there kind of a way to combat that, I guess?
So I thought of something, and this is something I talked with my mom about, because, we're Muslims, so we can talk about it. There's this very passionate attachment to the Quran, and it's very real, and in my opinion, it makes sense. But what I tried to do is I talked to my mom about it. Like, think of it this way: there's the facts, and there's also like ways to interpret those facts. So there's ways you can, for example, take an ayah from the Quran and say, well, this really means this, and you can spin it, and you can justify virtually anything. And we've seen it around the world. So I told her to think of the news as the same thing. We have all these interpreters, and it's up to you to decide who you trust and who you think is actually accredited and has the experience to decipher the facts and then tell you the truth behind it all. So, I think every Muslim has the ability to do this. And I think once they understand it that way, that there are multiple ways to look at a fact and understand it, and that every journalist is really trying to figure it out before they put their opinion out there. It cut right through, and she understood it right away.
It's actually a good example. That's a good one. I'll use that next time. So do you guys feel like the shift is also a shift in who's absorbing the news, and that the speed of the news cycle has increased the pressure on you to cater it, or to do more puff pieces, or to do more clickbait, as they call it?
This is like one of the positive sides of a lot of advertising revenue being taken by Google and Facebook away from digital media outlets like HuffPost and Slate. Is I think the thinking has really shifted, and I think audiences need to get that too. The incentive for clickbait, I don't know if you both agree, like, has gone down, because we're now trying to reach a more targeted, committed, and loyal audience that we know, which is much more valuable to us than like the biggest audience possible. And so that I actually think is a positive development, because you're really trying to cultivate your brand and your outlet.
Okay, and then what are some of the drawbacks to the rapid shift in the news cycle?
I mean, there's some pretty obvious ones, right? I mean, you can make news out of anything, and it really feels like you can go from talking about the border as being a crisis to talking about the boat being stuck in the Suez in an instant. And I think we've seen that, and we all feel it. And there's this question of like, what happened to that coverage, and what happened to that coverage? And so, and especially when we're talking about loyalty, and Akbar, I think you had a really, really good point about trying to reach a targeted audience and try to create and earn loyalty. There is a competitiveness between the right and the left right now that I think has been stronger than ever, as far as like media outlets talking about each other. And what I see a lot on both the right and the left are accusations that the one side isn't taking one issue seriously and the other side isn't. But the reality is, if you go on Fox News and you look for an article, chances are you will find it. And if you do the same thing on CNN, chances are you will find it. But people don't look. And so it's really easy to just say anything you want about anything. And there's really no accountability. And I think that's created a huge problem between readers. It's that we don't really know how to appeal to people, because they just are living in really opposite land, and I think that's a problem that I've seen at Slate, trying to appeal to like the right-wing mindset, trying to see. And this is something I did with my video series, Who's Afraid of Aim Ismail, where I interviewed right-wing apologists who were writing, like this guy named Jim Hoft, who had this website called The Gateway Pundit. And I thought we had a really good discussion. I thought the product and the story was really, really great. But then they find a way to say, oh, Ayman doesn't actually care about ISIS, or Ayman doesn't care about XYZ. And it just moves on so quick. All right, cool. Opinion registered, next topic. And so I think that's, I think we're really in unprecedented times when it comes to how fast the news cycle is moving.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hear it all the time also that, the media doesn't cover this or the media doesn't cover that. It's like, it's all being covered somewhere. It's just really hard to find it because you have to, be on top of it.
Right. If the media didn't cover it, you wouldn't know about it.
Right, exactly. And there's often a critique that there may be just not enough Muslims or journalism in media. That may be the reason that people feel like, those issues aren't elevated. But with the growth of online journalism, can this level the playing field? I mean, if we move away from having to have traditional newsrooms or people having to live in city centers to have those jobs, is it going to be more accessible across the board for Muslims to enter the field and for also to attract more Muslim readers into these different publications?
I think it's a good and bad thing. I think it's good because it, again, you said like levels the playing field, so more and more Muslim journalists can join the journalism field from wherever they are and contribute and be a diverse voice. But then you have the other point where it's like, if everything is online, then there's like older folks who are only watching broadcast television, nightly news, where you don't see Muslims there, or Muslim analysts, for example, talking about, what's happening in the news. Then, there's certain groups that aren't seeing us. And I think we need all groups to see us in the news for us to be like, okay, hey, we're here. Because as of right now, if we're just being online, then there's like a very niche group that's looking at us. And that's people who are on Twitter all the time, or people who actually follow different journalists. But, if I were, to ask like an older person, do you know who Ayman Knight is? No offense, Ayman, but they might not know because, they don't listen to podcasts, or, they don't, go on YouTube or Twitter, and they're just watching like their CBS, their CNN, their Fox News at night.
And from your experience, do you think, I mean, the field has evolved a lot from 15 years ago. What are kind of the differences between then and now? And also, is it a must to have digital capabilities to enter journalism in this era? Or are the tenets of journalism enough to get you and you can kind of learn it, which is like, your reporting, storytelling, kind of like the core?
I've been working a lot on diversity, across the industry, and I think with this sense of we need to increase representation, whether it's Muslims, whether it's historically marginalized communities in the US, right? Black folks, Asian Americans, lots of people. I think to your point, like we have to ensure there's no question that like the basic tenets of journalism need to be the same, because one of the big lessons of diversity efforts over the last 10, 15, 20 years is you can't just say, we'll have this person here. You have to have that person set up to succeed, right? And have them be in a position where they will be respected by everyone else. And I think that's where like the conversation on diversity needs to speed up a little bit, because it's a lot of we'll hire, we'll have them. And then, to your point, Rawan, like you might not have them on the nightly news, right? But you may say we have Muslims in the newsroom. So how do you get someone to a point where power brokers who remain overwhelmingly older, white, and male take them seriously? And we can't deny people that.
And just to add to that really quickly, I mean, that's how I got into journalism. Starting out, I worked in nonprofits and communication. And when I decided like this is something that I really want to do, all the journalists that I spoke to, they said, we need to go back to school because you need clips and you need credentials basically. And there's not a lot of people I feel like that you hear, like, do you need to get a master's degree to work in journalism? I mean, the answer is no, but I didn't have that foundation. So I went back to school, got that foundation, got the job where I am now. And they're like, oh, okay, so you have a degree from Georgetown University in journalism, so you must know how to do A, B, and C. So we trust you. So definitely agree with Akbar.
Yeah, and what I find really interesting about journalism is that a lot of it is dependent on access. And so if you can't get in the room with the people you want to talk to and earn their trust, you're not going to get a good story. You might get a fake story. Even they might give you a version of the story that's not complete. So I think in some cases, and not all cases, some cases, a Muslim who doesn't have a journalism background can do a better story than a non-Muslim can who went to Harvard journalism school. You know what I'm saying? It's really about being able to communicate with people, and I think that's the part about journalism that I think gets overlooked a lot. You know, and some people make the mistake of just doing parachute journalism. It's when someone shows up to Ferguson to tell the story about Ferguson, when in reality, a local who just lives there, grew up there, can tell a 10 times better story than you can. So I think there needs to be an appreciation, not just for diversifying the newsroom because it looks good, or that you might get dragged on Twitter for not having the right amount of people in the room, but also your journalism is going to suffer. The stories in the magazine won't be as good unless you have anybody really in the room who can speak the language, for example, who can navigate the cultural nuances. All of these things are super important when it comes to storytelling.
Yes, guilty of parachuting as a national journalist. Do it all the time.
Same.
So, Ayman, we're turning to questions from people who are watching, if you guys are okay with that. Ayman, the first question is for you. What is one principle of Islam you adhere to in your reporting or your storytelling, and why is it important?
All of them. I mean, if I had to pick one, I would say fight corruption, even if it's within yourself. I think that's a verse that really changed the way that I live. You know, there's a certain amount of introspection that's necessary to be, you know, to be a good journalist. You need to always be questioning your biases. You know, that feeling of something is done because you're tired and you want to move on. You have to keep challenging that, because the stories that you're telling deserve to be told in completion. You know, and I saw another question in the chat about, is your story just about like putting the facts, or does there need to be some kind of analysis? Both. I mean, that's the thing. It's every subject is deserving of the most purest version of that story. Because as a journalist, we don't really understand, or I don't really understand the reach that we have, and how many people's opinions have changed after they've read or watched our work. You know, Rawan works with children. That's amazing. And so I think there needs to be as much effort on our parts to really look inward and try and humble yourselves and challenge your expertise, so that you make sure you get the story right.
Great. And Akbar, anyone can answer this, but this might be more for you given your background. What are journalists doing to incorporate more non-American voices in coverage of America's foreign policy?
I think that a lot of people in that community are coming up, right? So you see this in coverage of like the Uyghur crisis, I think is a really important one, where you see a lot of Uyghurs who are in, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Europe now, whether it's Central Asian countries, are really getting in touch with like major international news outlets, but they could be doing more, right? I mean, American foreign policy has an especially fraught record in the Muslim majority world in the last 20 years. I think there are amazing local publications and local journalists. We just reported, my colleague Roweda Abdulaziz, who some of you might know, and I, on a journalist in Yemen who was amazing, and he was a fixer. And he got arrested, we got him released. He started to talk about why he didn't want to work with CNN or PBS or Vice or all these places he'd worked with, right? He said, I don't get respected. So I think elevating those voices and understanding that, like to your point, Eamon, someone in Yemen can talk more about the effect of drone strikes or the US supporting the Saudi blockade that is like starving millions of people, much more than us in DC or London or New York who come in for a week, are like, there's a blockade, it's bad. But I don't think we're doing enough. And I think that goes back to the question of who makes decisions about resources, because understanding different kinds of expertise is also unfortunately really lacking right now.
Okay, so how does the uncertain, and this is for anybody, how does the uncertain nature of journalism in the digital age, revenues, corporate mergers, unionization, or union busting affect your work as journalists?
That's sort of a good question. Yeah, like Akbar said, there were a lot of jobs that were lost during COVID. I just quickly Googled it. It was 30,000 media jobs wiped out across like 30, 40 different outlets, and it's crazy. So I think there needs to be, well, I don't know if there needs to be, but I think for me personally, yeah, I don't know. I feel like a little bit like the onus of the success the success of the platform that you're on depends on you, and it gets a little heavy to carry that around. And so if the magazine isn't doing like as good as it did last week, I feel like this extra pressure to do extra work and to be on the Slack chatting way past midnight just so that people can think subconsciously, oh, hey man, yeah, he's working. He's not at home wasting time. So I feel like there's this desperation in the air a little bit where people are conscious of the fact that there is this advertising money isn't as good as it used to be a year ago, and that we need to switch to the subscription model. At least that's what we're doing at Slate. We want subscribers now, and the like wanting to lure those people in really depends on your work. Do old people think that it's deserving of money when they could just get it for free on WhatsApp? So yeah, it's scary.
To that point, just a follow-up that I thought of. What do you guys think about news being behind a paywall? Because obviously journalists need to get paid, but also isn't the idea that you have to make it available for as far wide an audience as possible because you're creating awareness about something? And how do you split the difference there?
I feel like I'm in a full communist mode today, so I'll apologize. But truly, I feel like this question is often asked of journalists, and we're journalists. We're not business people, right? And if you look at like a lot of the failures of why people have been laid off in journalism in the last year, 5 years, it is venture capitalists, it is hedge funds, it is owners, like families that decided they wanted to make more profit suddenly, which they had never made before, right? So like we aren't making those decisions. I would say to the point about like, do subscriptions work or not? They clearly work, right? They clearly work for the New York Times. They are on their way to working for the Washington Post. But that to me is extremely alarming. The Times hired BuzzFeed's editor-in-chief last year as a media columnist. And his first piece after he joined the New York Times was, everyone cannot work for the New York Times, which is correct, right? We cannot just have like 3 outlets that are well-funded and everyone is desperate to get a job there. And that's where we're headed. So unless communities step up and support other outlets, I don't know what we're going to do, but that's where we are headed.
Yeah, that's a good point. Another question coming in from young journalists. So would you guys have tips on how they can revamp their digital skills and their portfolios to help them be successful in the current climate?
I feel like I'm probably qualified to answer this, but I mean, clips. You need clips. You need stories to show for yourself, and that can be stories from your community, stories about things that you may have heard through a WhatsApp group or through a texting group, just like following up, and there's so many YouTube videos these days about like, how do I record great video on my iPhone, or how do I record how do you record there's an app, I'm forgetting the name of it, but you can like record a full-on podcast series literally just from your phone and like with some headphones. So look for those things, and there's so many free resources out there, and the biggest thing for me is reach out to other young journalists. I mean, that's one thing that I did that I feel like really, elevated my experience as a young journalist, is speaking to other young, especially young Muslim journalists, You know, I was working at a nonprofit in the DC area, and I just emailed everyone I could, like, can I grab coffee with you? Like, you know, tell me what it's like to do your job, and just, you know, ask for informational interviews. Those are so helpful. And I think they really help you with, like, just getting yourself inspired and seeing, like, is this what I want to do? And this is how I want to do it. You know, be a journalist and ask questions to other journalists and get their stories, basically.
And
I want to add one more thing, and it just, like, consume as much good journalism as you can. That's really the name of the game for me. Like, stop reading Vice, read AP. Sorry, anybody if you guys work with Vice.
do you guys find that, to your point, a lot more kind of infographics and data journalism? I went to a conference where you know, there was all these like new programming languages and stuff that journalists can incorporate in order to kind of do visual journalism on Twitter and on web platforms and stuff. I'm not as familiar with it on the TV side, but I see that it's becoming a thing now. Do you guys have people on your staff that are exclusively dedicated to that, or is that a skill that, you know, if people have the chance to do some of that more kind of programming work to be able to create infographics to go with their stories and do that kind of analysis of data journalism, that would be useful?
We do, and it's like one of the things I'm most grateful for all the time. I think explaining something like, again, to go back to Yemen, I report a lot on the war in Yemen. It's really hard for people to visualize like 7 million people are on the brink of starvation. If you can do some sort of graphic that like even just has little icons, like showing you this is how many and here's a ton of them, you're like, oh, this is different. And I found that that's impactful. Having dedicated people for that is really good. I think it's good for young journalists to develop those skills. I also think there are like extremely qualified professionals who we should defer to and hire to do that.
So we have another question here about keeping the recent election in mind and keeping the misinformation campaign that a recent intel report says that Russia used misinformation against Biden in mind. With those things in mind, has reaching certain people and communities become harder because there's a very strong and obvious disagreement in opinions? Is social media increasing the divide? And has the quality and integrity of the information been hurt by this?
Can I turn it into Sheikh Ayman real quick? These people are talked about in the Quran, and it's really, really trippy when you get to that part and you read about it in this context. There are people in the Quran where Rabbana talks about the ignorant people, and no matter how much they hear anything, they come up with any reason to disbelieve. And the best thing that we could do is just leave them alone and focus on our own deeds. And I think that's the approach that I'm doing for my own journalism, because these people they exist, and some of them are trolls, and they follow their weird figureheads, their cows carved into the rock. Yeah, it's strange. And I think I've wasted a lot of time in my career trying to appeal to those people, trying to meet them in the middle. You know, doing a whole series about, you know, myths about the Muslims. And I'm glad that I did that work, and I'm proud of it. But at the same time, I don't think I changed anyone on that side's mind. I don't think anyone thought to themselves, oh, this Muslim's making sense. No, there's like trap doors for themselves. They say, oh no, there's taqiyya, where a Muslim is allowed to lie for any reason. You know, that there's ways where they can convince themselves that what they're seeing isn't true. So yeah, for anyone who's like young and wants to be a journalist, who wants to just like save the world and convince all of these people that there is such thing as a definitive truth, I tried.
Another question actually connected to the last one about young journalists. Can they take advantage of streaming platforms like Twitch? And is that, you know, or I guess any other streaming platforms too?
I'm so sorry. Can I just hop on one point of the last question? Because I think it was just really put really well about social media increasing the divide. And I think about the Jamal Khashoggi case, which I covered really closely. Saudi Arabia has one of the highest levels of Twitter penetration of any country in the world. And it's also a very young country, right? More than 70% of people are under 30. After Jamal Khashoggi's murder, the number of bots and trolls you have that the US intel community and others have reported on to paint him as an extremist was unreal. And what's super scary to me is thinking about how many young Saudis are on Twitter being fed these hashtags. And it doesn't look like government propaganda because it's not coming from, it's not on TV, it's not in the government sponsored newspaper. And I think that's what we really have to be careful of, is how can people be hurt by the misuse of social media platforms? And who are forces that have resources to use it, whether it's the Russians in the election, whether it's the Saudi regime, in ways we just can't imagine.
So that's a good point. And actually, a follow-up question just came in on this. So the ultimate solution, what would be the ultimate solution to fake news and polarization? And this person is asking, can we really try to write off all the people as Ayman is suggesting? Do you want to take it away?
Should I, or should I let somebody else talk?
You can answer and then they can jump on since it's
okay. All right. So yeah, I think we can write these people off. and I'll tell you why. I'll convince you. Okay. So there are infinite news sources now. There is infinite facts and there's infinite ways to interpret these facts. Is there a way to unify and destroy all of the other facts and have people understand the world the way that you see it? If you think that the answer to that is yes, then sure, by all means, try and convince all these people. But I guarantee you that I'm telling you, they've found a way to convince themselves that what they're seeing isn't what's true. And I'm pretty sure the Trump administration said this verbatim. They were like, there are alternative facts and don't believe what you're seeing because that's a lie. You know what I'm saying? So, I think we're so far along in this process where people's trust in what they're seeing with their own eyes has eroded so far that they can watch someone like George Floyd get suffocated to death on camera. And then right after they can say, oh, well, he was probably a thug. You know what I'm saying? So how do you convince someone like that he was a human and didn't deserve to die that way? How do you do that? I don't think that it's possible.
I think on that point, like as journalists, I don't think we're in the business of convincing people. I think it's like the number one thing they teach you in journalism school. It's like you're there to present the facts, and then whatever people do with those facts is not, I mean, I don't want to say like no longer your concern, because it's always important to, figure out how your reporting is getting interpreted. But I think it's a lot of pressure to think that your journalism can then convince someone that, what they've been thinking for the last 15 years of their life has all been a lie. And it's also such a like Muslim principle where it's like, lakum dinakum waliya din, like you do your thing, I do my thing, and it just, you do your job and then the rest is up to them, really.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, same with like a Sandy Hook. How do you convince people that 26 kids died if they're not gonna believe that actually happened? So moving on to something else, have you guys seen more or less representation in the last 10 years from the Muslim community in your respective publications, newsrooms? And if so, why is that the case either way? So if you haven't, what more can we do? Or if you have, talk about that.
I think there's more. I think there's a huge interest. I mean, particularly around the 2016 election and the aftermath, there was a huge interest in, clearly we have a presidential candidate who has called to ban all Muslims in the country. Let's like have more representation. I think the problem that lingers is still either an expectation that like Muslim journalists do Muslim issues, which runs across so many underrepresented groups, right? It's like a Black journalist will be asked to cover police brutality or whatever it is. And that's incredibly unfair. And then I think that there is still a lack of accounting for like the real range of the Muslim experience, right? It's not just it's so many things. We saw this with these recent controversies over terrible TV shows about Muslims coming to America. Like, they're really bad, right? And I think we don't have TV writers, we don't have people who are presenting a Muslim the way that like Rami did. I think that was a pioneering thing, but there was only one Rami, right? We don't have 10.
Do you guys want to share your experiences? Have you seen more or less Muslims?
Yeah, I'll go real quick. It's night and day for me. Like Akbar said, before Trump and after Trump, it's been totally different. Now we have 3 different Muslim news anchors on prime time. We have Mehdi Hassan, Ali Vishli, and Ayman Mohiddin. And that's incredible. And when I was growing up, we had Fareed Zakaria, and that was it. And we were proud of him, and we were so happy with him, but that was it. So I think there is this expectation for my entire career that I was a Muslim guy, so I should talk about Muslim stuff. And for a long time I did, because I thought I could do it better than anybody else in my newsroom. But, you know, Mehdi Hassan is on TV every night with a nightly show talking about everything. And I don't think I could have predicted that that would have happened so soon.
And really quickly, I was one of those who, after the 2016 election, was like, I need to get back into journalism. But yes, also Amna Nawaz, as it says in the comments, Amna Nawaz at the PBS NewsHour, she's been incredible and really cool to look up to and work with her.
Well, Rawan, do you want to just elaborate on that a little bit? What happened in 2016 that, you know, opened the floodgates for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think journalism was always something that I was interested in high school and in college, and then I didn't get a job in journalism, and I just kind of went with the flow there. And then 2016 happened, and I was like, how is this happening? Like, how is there someone on every news channel, on, you know, all over my Twitter, all over my Facebook, saying that, you know, Muslims hate us, and there's a problem with Muslims, and we need to get them out of this country. And I was like, how is this something that's being played over and over and over again? And I think it really frustrated me and like got me emotional. And I was like, I can't sit around. And like, I was one of those, like, I need to change the world. I was like, I can't just sit around and like let, just kind of there'll be pundits and analysts on news channels talking about, you know, well, the Muslim community this, well, the Muslim community this. And I didn't see a Muslim person talking about the Muslim community in the news. And I was like, what is happening? And so, you know, as a person who has burden syndrome, I took it upon myself to then be like, I need to go back to school and I need to get in. This is, you know, my little contribution to you know, representation as a Muslim woman, as a Muslim woman who wears hijab in the media also, is like very much, we're a rare breed for sure. So whenever I see like Ruwaida from the Huffington Post, I'm just like, yes. And I get really excited. So I think, yeah, a lot of frustration drove me to get back into journalism and really decided this is what I wanted to do.
We're glad to have you. So now for the wrap-up thought, guys, as Muslims, did you feel your journey into journalism was hindered by anything, including prejudice, treatment from the establishment, and as you guys have mentioned, any pressure to share Muslim stories? And, you know, I'll say a little bit about what I feel about this. They've asked me to, and then I will turn it over to you guys. And yes, I cannot count the number of times that family or anybody or work has asked me to like go cover that Muslim issue, or like, I'm not a good Muslim if I'm not like focused all my time on the Muslim issues. And, you know, part of getting recognition in our society and work as journalists, it's like a journalist covers the story that needs to be covered. It doesn't have to be this one. It can be anything that's important, and our issues are important. And then there's a lot of other issues that are important. It shouldn't preclude us from covering George Floyd. I mean, I was in Minneapolis doing that too. I don't think that, you know, it's a vacuum and like one can't be done with the other. I think that if conversely, some of our colleagues who are not Muslim or come from other walks of life cover Muslim issues, it helps the cause. It actually elevates it, because then you can't be accused of like, you know, bias or doing your own people or whatever it is. So it actually the cross-pollination of everybody kind of doing everybody's issues will ultimately end, I think, in a better result. But you guys go ahead.
I'll start. I would just contextualize the US as someone focused on foreign policy within like two other wealthy multiracial democracies I think are going in really different directions, and we need to keep in mind as we think about how the US can progress. Britain has done a pretty good job of like having Muslim representation. France is currently trying to push Muslims into the shadows. And I think the US is faced with this incredibly tough choice. And as Muslim journalists, like we are part of the foreground is like preventing us from going into a France situation. That said, I'll say the most discrimination I ever received in my job as a Muslim was from another Muslim who went to my boss and told them I was a Muslim Brotherhood agent, right? So we need to also think so much about like, but not even my boss, like my boss's boss's boss, right? High level. We need to think so much about how we internalize the racialization and stereotypes that Muslims have been subjected to and deploy them violently, not just like fall into them, but like just it becomes part of our DNA. So I would just caution anyone dealing with media to be really conscious of that. But yeah, Muslim journalists are amazing and we are fighting and we are here.
Amen. And Rawan, to wrap up thoughts about prejudice or,
yeah,
you know.
So prejudice is inescapable. Everybody has it, even white liberals. Malcolm X famously once said that the worst people out there were white liberals because they just didn't know how offensive they were or how prejudiced they were. That being said, I think every Muslim in this country has this amazing, wonderful superpower where we can just deflect it. You know, it just bounces off of us. And I think if we can maintain and just keep doing the work, regardless of what people are saying about us, or regardless of the, the pushback, then, it's going to be worth it because we're paving the way for the next generation. And I guarantee you that half the newsrooms out there right now with all white editors and all white editors in chiefs, that's going to change in one generation. That's not good. This is the last generation where that's the case. That being said, funniest piece of anti-Muslim racism I've experienced, I was like 18, 19 maybe, getting my first journalism job. And the editor-in-chief of the magazine, who I did an interview with, didn't know I was coming in, made a joke out loud in the newsroom. He was like, "Oh, we got a Muslim guy now. Let's see. Let's start an office pool to see how long it takes for him to blow up the office." And he thought it was hilarious. And I secretly a little bit thought it was funny, but I just ignored him. And the next day we were best friends. So it happens. But the best thing, in my opinion, that you can do is just sort of stay focused, pull a Jackie Robinson, and just do your work and impress him.
I do not have your patience, Amen. But I just wanted to say that I'm very blessed and lucky to, with the team that I'm in, to not have dealt with anything in the past few years that I've been at the NewsHour. On the contrary, there are several conversations happening about how do we, criticizing our own team and like, how do we make ourselves better? And how do we have these conversations where white editors are not feeling defensive when POC staff writers or producers are saying like, no, actually, I think we need to cover this, this, and this, and we want you to listen to us. Probably one of the only things that I can think of is when I was in grad school, we had to do several man on the street interviews, which are not my forte, but I was asking a question about Kaepernick and, kneeling during the national anthem. And the person answering was like, well, what do you think? You seem to have an opinion. And that's something like, as a hijab wearing woman in America, it's very hard to escape my identity. And so so I had to be like, no, like I'm asking you the question. It doesn't matter what I think. I'm asking you, what you think. So I think it's just about brushing it off and being, like Ayman said, that superhero, that having that superpower, and just being like, we're here to do the hard work, and continuing that work and succeeding is the way that will show, this is why we're here. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And you don't have one bad thing to say about my work, do you? So, I mean, there it is.
Yeah, that's a really great, actually, example. And that's what I think we all can agree, that if you stand by your work, you'll get very far, because in journalism, there's nothing else that will make or break you. You just got, you have to stand by. So that, I think, concludes everything. Guys, thank you. And for all the young people, you can be like these brilliant journalists we've just met if you just stick to it. And we need you. We need the community to come together. So please don't become a doctor, lawyer, and engineer. That's my closing thought. Become a journalist.
We have too many of those.
Exactly. We're done. We're overrepresented. We got to come this way. So, and I will pass it back to Ambassador Siddiqui or Shahid, whoever would like to close it out.
Yeah, I'll close it out. Thank you so much, guys. Very informative conversation. I think it's wonderful to know the direction that journalism is going, and especially to have you guys here with us at the forefront. I mean, we've learned so much, and now I've left this conversation so optimistic. I mean, Ayman is telling us that in one generation, if we continue to patiently persevere, significant change is going to be happening. And I think we just need to keep working hard, keep having important conversations like this, and continue to inspire the next generation. And you guys are doing just that. For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Have a good night, and Assalamu alaikum. Take care. Bye, everyone.